Okay, so on today's podcast episode, we are talking about imposter syndrome and self doubt. And what do we do with that? And I want you to know why this topic is so important. That if we want to embrace being fierce leaders, whether that's leading your business, leading at work, excelling in your career, leading in your home, with your family, with your kids, wherever you are being called to lead, we also need to face the elephant in the room, which is doubt. And today we're going to really be talking and breaking down like what is imposter syndrome, because the word gets thrown around a lot. And I think that it does have different meanings and definitions and uses. And I want to break it down here with you today because, yes, more than likely, if you're listening to this, you have felt imposter syndrome at some point, and that's normal. But I also really want to have a conversation about how we live in a society that loves to pathologize things. And I get it, because if we're kind of living in like our Western medical model world, the reason why I'm going to say like pathologizing something can be helpful is because what we know and what we're used to kind of from the medical model, and I can say this because like I came from the healthcare industry too, is that when we can like categorize something as, I'm going to say like an illness, a diagnosis, right? So the diagnosis is imposter syndrome. Again, for me, it's like the use of the word syndrome that makes it even feel more medically. And here's why I would say, like, I can see where that comes from, because in our world, once we diagnose something, once we categorize something, technically we can start to do research on what symptoms go with this syndrome, what makes people feel like this. It helps us like understand what are some of the causes of it. And ultimately, the goal is usually like, how can we ultimately, quote unquote, treat this? How, if someone comes to me and says, hey, I'm having imposter syndrome, we love being able to be like, oh, okay, imposter syndrome, right? Okay, let's look up that diagnosis. Oh, here's the treatment. Let's try this. It's kind of like a plug and play. I know this, so I'm going to do this. The reason why I don't like using this term is because when you think about it, imposter syndrome is really your emotions coming up and you not feeling equipped, or you don't have the tools on how do I sit with that. Imposter syndrome really isn't that different than when you're feeling anxious about something or you're feeling overwhelmed about something. Like, our emotions come up to us in our everyday life, oftentimes related to certain situations. Like, for example, I used to get very anxious and upset when I was sitting at a red light. I don't call that a syndrome, though. I don't call that anxious at a red light syndrome. And I'm not saying this to make light of people who also resonate and have a medical diagnosis around a mental health issue. I'm not trying to make light of it, but you can see where, and again, I like, as I explained, I know there's a reason and a purpose for why some things do need a diagnosis, so that we can do research, so that we can figure out what's the cause and then ultimately come up with effective treatment plans. But again, like, as I mentioned, so anxiousness at a red light is not a syndrome technically, but it is my emotions coming up in a certain situation. And with imposter syndrome, as we're calling it, or as some people will have heard of it, is certain emotions coming up related to a certain situation. Okay, so I've led a imposter syndrome workshop now for about the last year for women in leadership groups, women business owners, also just for busy professionals, and I actually did it for a conference for a group of lawyers last year. Like, again, imposter syndrome is normal, but let's just say what it really is. Imposter syndrome is my emotions coming up when I'm doing something new or when I don't feel like I should be at the table. But it's emotions. It's like, how do I deal with this? The other thing about imposter syndrome is that oftentimes it's going to be related to like a mind component and a body component. So, what do I mean by that? So, when we notice the phenomena of imposter syndrome coming up, I'd be curious for you. It's like, well, what thoughts are growing through your head when you're labeling something that, right? So, is it like, let's just say, again, imposter syndrome could show up in so many different ways depending on your life. But let's say you are preparing because you have to do a big pitch or a big presentation, and you are in a leadership position, but you're really feeling some imposter syndrome as you go into that because you're going to have to talk to some other big wigs in your company or other people in leadership or whatever it is. And so you're feeling maybe doubt, anxiousness. Okay. And I suppose I'm talking about the feelings here. So you might be feeling anxious in your body, but the thoughts also might be, who am I to do this? Oh my gosh, I'm going to screw this up today. I don't feel up to this. What are they going to think of me? So it's a stream of thoughts coming in. It's emotions or maybe some sensations that you're noticing in your body that feel uncomfortable before you do this big pitch or big presentation. And many people would label that as, oh, you're experiencing some imposter syndrome. But also you're experiencing some fear, you're experiencing some doubt, oh, you're having some anxiety, oh, the thoughts that are playing in your head are like feeding into this phenomena.